Well, thank you. Before I begin this sprint through about 125 years of Texas political history, let me pay tribute to you and the job that you do. I know that when I was a state legislator, I innocently accepted an invitation from a civics teacher to come talk to her classes all day. And I found that whereas it was wonderful to talk to a group like this for 30 minutes and go home, that what she had to do every day, what you have to do every day, is truly exhausting and certainly important, but I really admire the physical exertion that's required from the practice of classroom instruction. Well, I've been asked to talk about the rise of two-party Texas in the TEACs. That is listed as one of the things that is supposed to be taught, but I noticed that, and it's been highlighted here, conservatism jumps out of the list of important concepts in Texas history, and truly that is the main message that I hope to leave. And that is, as we know, Texas is a conservative state. It has always been a conservative state. The nature of a pioneer society, particularly one that found a struggle against both nature and humankind in its formation, was by its nature very conservative. Plus the people who came here, for the most part, Scots-Irish, were very religious people, very suspicious of government. They left wherever they came from because they didn't like the people who were there, usually people of an elite. All this created the nature of Texas conservatism. And the chief lesson politically was that because of this innate Texas conservatism, whichever political party represented those values became not just the majority party in Texas, but the all-consuming, all-dominating party. For over 100 years, that was the Democratic Party, for reasons I'll mention in a moment. And then starting in the 1970s, it began to shift toward what we have today, which is essentially domination by the Republican Party. The TEAC speaks of two-party Texas, but we only had two-party Texas for about 15 or 20 years, I would say, before the Republican Party became all dominant. We are probably entering another two-party era as the Democratic Party comes back, and I'll speak to that in a moment. Because of conservatism, Texas was clearly a state willing to join the Confederacy, and the post-war Reconstruction period, as you know from history, was dominated by Republicans who came in from the North, who carried their belongings in a carpet bag. They were called the carpetbaggers, and as a result of their misadministration, or shall we say, highly tyrannical administration of state government, the Constitution of 1876, under which we still live, envisions a very small government with very divided and weakened powers. That was the essence of Texas conservatism, and the Democratic Party was its conveyor. That experience of the Civil War and Reconstruction continued on into the 20th century. Sam Rayburn, who you may know was the great Speaker of the House, still has the record of being Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives longer than anybody else, was born in 1882. He was the son of a Confederate soldier. Now, he was born in 1882. That meant that he was born 17 years after the end of the Civil War, and yet the remembrance of that struggle, and especially Reconstruction, motivated his views about politics. And he said, "As long as I honor the memory of the Confederate dead and revere the gallant devotion of my Confederate father to the Southland, I will never vote for the electors of the Republican Party, which sent the carpetbagger and the scalawag to prostrate the South with saber and sword." Well, this was his view. He died in 1961. I can tell you, because of entering into the political climate in the 1960s, that attitude still existed, clearly from people of younger generations than those who lived around the Civil War. But that feeling of loyalty to family tradition and to state tradition was very, very powerful. And when in 1961, I started ringing doorbells in the campaign of a gentleman named John Tower, which we'll talk about in a second, I still hear people say, well, I kind of like what he stands for, but my granddaddy would roll over in his grave if he knew that I voted for a Republican. That was very much the attitude that existed as of the coming of John Tower. Well, who was he? He was a political science professor from Wichita Falls. He was active in the very tiny Republican Party that did carry on in that period. And let's take a quick moment to say, what was the Republican Party back in the days of total Democratic dominance? It existed basically to wait for those days when there would be a national Republican administration in Washington. Now, Texas would not elect Republicans to office. It wouldn't vote Republican for president. But if a Republican president came into office, like Calvin Coolidge, then who would be in charge of patronage in the state of Texas? That would mean federal judgeships. It would mean customs commissioners, and it would mean postmasters. All those jobs were pretty much dependent upon being loyal to the party in Washington. They didn't really care about winning public office. There would be candidates now and then, and John Tower was one of those people who was willing to be the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate against Lyndon Johnson, great master of Texas politics, when Johnson ran for re-election in 1960. But under laws that were passed not far from here to accommodate Johnson's run for the presidency, he was able to do two things at once: to run as John F. Kennedy's vice presidential candidate and for re-election to his seat in the U.S. Senate. Kennedy-Johnson was elected. Johnson had to resign from the Senate, and under state law, a special election had to be held. It was held in the spring of 1961. Tower, having made that brave race against Johnson the previous fall, getting about 40% of the vote, was the natural Republican standard bearer. There wasn't anybody else. There were no members of Congress or county commissioners or anybody else to do this. It was the political science professor from Wichita Falls. And by a very tiny margin, he won. Now, he became not only the first Republican elected to statewide office in Texas, he was the first Republican member of the Senate to be elected from the entire Confederacy since the Civil War. Today, when a bulk of all Republican senators are from the South, it shows how much not just Texas, but the entire South has changed politically. Well, Tower's election was motivated in part by a realization on the part of a growing number of people that the Democratic Party nationwide was clearly far to the left of where Texas conservatives were. That was nothing new. It had happened starting in Franklin Roosevelt's time and accelerated under Harry Truman and then under John F. Kennedy. So there was a great belief that the Democratic Party nationwide had drifted away from where Texans were, and that this was the time to change parties. Something else was happening too. The state was growing, and there were new Texans, people who came in after World War II, like my family, like the George Bush family, who were looking for job opportunities in the cities where opportunities existed. And whereas in the North, we pretty much have the pattern where the cities are Democratic and the country areas are Republican, the reverse was the case in Texas and other places in the South. The cities where the new people came, the people who were used to two parties, were the ones who tended to vote Republican, whereas the rural areas were still very strongly Democratic, as we'll see. So someday when I do this talk again, I'll show you a map of what it was like when John Tower got elected to the Senate. He only carried maybe about 24 counties in Texas, at most, out of 254. But those were the city areas, and that helped carry the day. Well, the Texas Democrats knew what their challenge was that they had to counter this sudden growth of interest in the Republican Party. And they did it through a devastatingly successful means, and that was a gentleman named John Connally, who was elected governor of Texas the very next year after Tower was elected to the U.S. Senate. Connally, who's shown here when he was Secretary of the Navy under John F. Kennedy for a very brief period, came back from Washington and ran for governor. He was the absolute essence of Texas conservative Democratic control of the state of Texas, which existed not just in the governor's mansion, but all the way through the legislature, down through the county courthouses. It was very much the power structure that Lyndon Johnson maintained, and John Connally was one of Lyndon Johnson's most important heirs. In many ways, he was the protege of Lyndon Johnson. What Connally did essentially was to stop the Republican Party from growing any further during the course of the 1960s. Now, during the 1960s, certain things did happen to help the Republican Party. One is the cities continued to grow. More people moved into places like Houston and Dallas and were voting Republican. Also, under Supreme Court decisions, the state had to redistrict and had to have legislative and congressional districts of equal size, and they had to be drawn in areas, therefore, where Republicans lived. So for the first time, Republicans began to be elected to the Congress and to the legislature in more than just single-digit numbers. One of those was George Bush, who was elected to Congress, as Liz mentioned in the introduction of me, in 1966 from a district on the west side of Houston, which then as now is one of the strongest Republican districts in the country. George Bush ran for the U.S. Senate in 1970, and we have a map of that. He ran against Lloyd Benson. Benson was like John Connally, a very strikingly handsome, very beautifully spoken, and very impressive individual. Had a great career at the University of Texas, and he was the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate in 1970. And as you see from the results, Benson won by 53-47. That's kind of a two-party vote. At least we'd think that in a state like Illinois or Pennsylvania. But look here, I've chosen to use red for the counties that were carried by George Bush. And in order to save blue ink, I did not ink in all the rest of Texas. But what we see here is that George Bush carried Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Tyler, Longview. He carried the Texas Hill Country, which, because of good Germans who had been there since the Civil War era, was always Republican. He carried Midland, Odessa, carried Lubbock, and he carried Panhandle, primarily Amarillo. Those were the centers of Republican strength, those cities of Texas where Republicans lived. Everything else, East Texas, West Texas, and South Texas, was solidly Democratic in the style of the day. Well, that's pretty much the way things were until 1978 rolled around, and that was when Republicans for the first time elected a governor of Texas. By narrow margin, Bill Clemens was elected. He was a very wealthy oil driller. He funded his own campaign. He made the famous mixed metaphor that previous Republican candidates had run out of gas in the fourth quarter. What he meant was that Republicans didn't have the money. He personally had the money. He funded his own campaign and got elected. And that helped motivate the transition of Texas to the two-party state that did exist when Republicans could be competitive for governor. Clements was elected in 78. He was defeated in 82. He was reelected in 86. In other words, there was a kind of back and forth. Meanwhile, Republicans were gaining seats in the legislature and in the Congress. And in 1994, the election of George W. Bush did very much help propel the Republican Party forward. And that's because Bush was able to not only win a big majority, but he used the power of his appointment to name Republicans to boards and commissions, much as Clements had done. And the strength that motivated the Bush election was in the growing, if you will, power of Republicans away from the counties that his father had carried. So here is what could be called the high water mark of Texas Republicanism. This was George W. Bush's re-election in 1998 against Gary Morrow, a liberal Democrat who was the state land commissioner. You can see that in addition to carrying Houston and Hill Country and Dallas-Fort Worth and Lubbock and Midland, Odessa, Bush carried East and West Texas. These are the centers of old-time conservatism in Texas. These were the people who, like Sam Rayburn, would never have thought of voting Republican. But after a while, you might say those old-timers who held to the old view just died, or otherwise they gave way to the realization that it was indeed the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, that was the conservative party for Texas. And that's why Gary Morrow only carried, as you see, the border counties, and that will remain the pattern. I point out one little outlier. Up here is a place called Ford County, F-O-A-R-D County, and it continued to vote Democratic until very recent days, and that's because it somehow retained an older Anglo-conservative Democratic population in this little county. And when you think that across the border is Oklahoma, which is all red, that it really was an island of old-time conservative democratism that just remained. If I were a real political scientist, I'd go to Ford County and I'd look there and see what was going on. Well, George W. Bush, of course, gave way to Rick Perry, and we're going to jump 12 years to the 2010 governor's race and see that things are starting to change a bit. Now, Perry won overwhelmingly in this particular race. He got about upper 50% of the vote, about 60% of the vote, but we begin to see some changes. And it's an interesting mirror image to how the Republican Party grew, because here the Democrat, Bill White, the former mayor of Houston, began to pick up urban counties. He carried Harris County and Dallas County, and he carried Bexar County here and Travis County where we are. And of course he carried El Paso and the Valley. Now, this did not help him get to elected governor, but it did point out that there are changes happening, largely because of the demographic changes of Texas in urban areas. The suburban areas around Houston, around Dallas, are still very solidly Republican. That's why people like Perry can be reelected and elected with a strong vote still in our time. But it will be the growth of those non-white Democratic constituencies, primarily African Americans and Mexican Americans and a large number of Asian Americans, that gives hope to the Democratic Party to come back in time. Now, let's go to 2012. There's an interesting set of examples there. Here's the results of the presidential race. Here's Mitt Romney winning the state by the margin that Texan Republicans win Texas, the upper 50 percentile. And here we see that Barack Obama carried Harris County, not by much. It was like about 500 votes out of 2 million. He carried Dallas County, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, and the Valley. That's still pretty much the basis of things. In fact, we go to the other race that was held during 2012, that of the U.S. Senate, where Ted Cruz defeated Paul Sadler. And here's Ted Cruz. We'll talk about him in a moment. He pretty much carries the same places that Romney carries, but he also carries Harris County. Ted Cruz is from Houston. And so he managed to carry Harris County. But you see the pattern of Texas politics today, in which East and West Texas are solidly Republican. The suburban counties around the big cities are solidly Republican. But the Democrats can get a fairly big vote just in a few counties, not unlike it was for John Tower or George Bush way back in the 60s when the Republicans were coming online. Now, what is the immediate future of politics in Texas? Well, there is this trend back toward the Democratic Party. That is, demographics are very much in the favor of the Democrats. But politics, what makes it so wonderful is that it is unpredictable, that there are always X factors that were going to come along. And that is, you can never tell what's going to happen in an election until you actually get candidates and circumstances that govern the debate at that particular time. And I predict that one of the things that's going to scramble the calculation of people about the fate of the Republican Party facing a rising Hispanic Texas is this gentleman, George P. Bush. He is the son of Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida. He is the nephew of George W. Bush and the grandson of President George Bush I. He is a true Mexican American. His mother was born in Mexico. And he speaks Spanish. He is every Hispanic mother's dream of the kind of fellow that she would like their daughter to marry. And he is making louder and louder noises of running for statewide office this next year in 2014. The office that he's interested in seeking is State Land Commissioner, which is open because the incumbent, Jerry Patterson, is interested in running for lieutenant governor. Land Commissioner is an interesting job. I think George P. Bush looks upon it as a step that he can make on his way upward. It's not his total ambition to be State Land Commissioner. And now, interesting thing about the Bushes, and I'm talking not just about him, I'm not talking just about his father and his uncle or his grandfather or his great-grandfather who was senator from Connecticut. They always lose their first race for office. And then they come back pretty well. But we'll see if George P. Bush runs into that. Frankly, I would say that if Land Commissioner is an open job, there's no incumbent to run against, Democrats are still fairly weak, and he is a very attractive candidate, that he may break the family curse and actually win his first race for public office. And I could be wrong. I could, the possibility that the great strength of the Democratic Party amongst Mexican Americans and African Americans and increasingly Asian Americans could scramble the formula for the Republican Party. But I think what it means is that the state will be, once again, a two-party state in which both parties have a chance to win statewide and certainly local office. And that for a period of time, we're not going to be in that time of total Democratic domination as we saw for a century, or total Republican domination as we've seen for the last 20 years. I'm told I have a minute left that I'm now going to throw back to you for any questions and discussion that you might have. Anybody want to try? Yes, please.